My son told me in front of 50 people that I had never influenced a single soul in my entire life. He said it while holding a glass of wine with a smile that cut deeper than any blade, as if the years I had given to teaching, guiding, and raising him meant less than the napkins on the banquet tables. The room froze for a moment, then a few nervous chuckles broke out, and I felt the weight of every eye sliding toward me, waiting for me to flinch, to laugh it off, to be the harmless old man who couldn't take a joke. My name is Elias Monroe. I am 75 years old. For 40 years I taught American history in the same public high school of our Pennsylvania town. I kept notebooks filled with lesson plans, clippings, student essays, small stories of local families, things I considered worth preserving. People called me the man with the dusty journals. They joked that I was more a librarian than a teacher. But in those notebooks lived the lifeblood of a community, fragments of who we were. And in that banquet hall, my own son, David Monroe, dismissed it all with a single sentence. David is 46, a businessman who built his company by sheer hunger for recognition. He thrives on applause, photographs, microphones. He has mastered the art of selling himself as a symbol of modern success. At that dinner, surrounded by colleagues, investors, and family, he decided to carve his legacy by carving me out of mine. He called me irrelevant, a relic, a man whose name would be forgotten the moment the dirt closed over my coffin. The words did not just bruise, they stripped me bare. It wasn't the first time he mocked my notebooks or my quiet way of life, but never before had he chosen a public stage. Never before had he looked me in the eye and declared that I was nothing. My daughter-in-law, Clara, sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She is a calculating woman, sharp with numbers and sharper with appearances. She let out a small laugh at his remark, the kind of laugh that tells everyone the insult was intentional, a performance. She looked around the room, inviting others to follow. And they did. I clenched my jaw and lifted the glass of water in front of me, pretending I was too old to catch the jab. Inside, however, my chest burned. The man who owed his very education, his first sense of discipline, to the roof I provided, and the meals his mother cooked, now used me as a prop to entertain his guests. Margaret, my late wife, would never have believed it if she had been alive to see it. She passed 10 years ago, and yet her presence was heavy that night, as if her absence made the betrayal sharper. She had always defended David, always insisted. There was good in him waiting to surface. I could almost hear her voice telling me not to react, not to make a scene, but I could not ignore the silence that followed. It was not laughter anymore. It was agreement. In that room full of educated, ambitious people, they nodded at David's cruelty because they believed it. They looked at me and saw a man who never published a book, never appeared on television, never built a business. To them, I was a nobody. David had cemented it with a single sentence. When the dinner ended, I walked out into the cold night without a word. The banquet hall glowed behind me, voices rising in toasts, the celebration, carrying on without me. The frost bit into my skin as I stood on the curb waiting for Clara's car. She came out first, clutching her purse, eyes flicking nervously at me. "You know he didn't mean it like that," she said, but her voice betrayed no sympathy, only calculation. Clara is practical to the bone. She weighs relationships like bank accounts. That night, she had made her choice, stand by her husband, even if it meant leaving me stripped in front of strangers. David emerged, moments later, still buzzing with pride. He slapped me on the back as though nothing had happened. Come on, Dad, don't take it so hard. You taught me not to care about what people think. Remember, he grinned, kissed Clara on the cheek, and guided her into the car. He left me standing on the sidewalk, his words echoing like a cruel parody of the lessons I had once taught him. I walked home instead of asking for a ride. At 75, my knees ache in the winter air, but that night I needed the cold to keep me awake. Each block of the neighborhood whispered of the years I had spent teaching. Houses where my students once lived, shops where I used to stop after work, the old church Margaret dragged me to every Sunday. They were small reminders that I had mattered once, even if only to a handful of lives. Yet David had managed to erase it all in one sentence. Back at home, the house creaked as though it too had aged beyond relevance. I went to the study where my notebooks lined the shelves, decades of handwriting stacked in quiet rows. I pulled one down, opened to a random page. A student's essay from 1989. Mr. Monroe taught me that history is not about famous men but about ordinary choices. I traced the faded ink with my finger. That student had written those words at 16. Where was she now? Did she even remember me? Or had she, like David, decided I was just an old man who taught nothing that lasted? I sat in that chair until dawn, surrounded by the ghosts of my own efforts. David's words gnawed at me. I told myself it was pride, that I was too old to crave recognition. But beneath the denial lay the deeper wound. He had said it because he believed it, and because the world believed it too. I realized then that what I had built was invisible. Influence without monuments, without applause, fades faster than breath. The morning brought no relief. The local paper carried a small piece about the dinner, complete with a quote from David. He was lauded as a voice of modern leadership, a man who rose above the weight of tradition. They printed his exact line, "My father never influenced anyone. I had to teach myself everything from the ground up." The words, now in ink, no longer belonged just to the banquet hall. They belonged to the public record, preserved in the very way I had once preserved stories of others. Only this time, it was my erasure that was recorded. I folded the paper, placed it beside Margaret's photograph on the mantel, and sat back. For the first time in my life, I wondered if David was right. Perhaps my life's work truly amounted to nothing. Perhaps the journals I filled, the stories I saved, were just the ramblings of a man afraid to be forgotten. And yet, in that moment of despair, something stirred, a whisper of defiance, faint but persistent. Influence is not measured by applause, I reminded myself. It is measured by truth. And truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way to the surface. That morning, I swore to myself that if David believed I had no influence, he would soon learn otherwise. A week after that dinner, an envelope came through my mailbox that was not supposed to be mine. It carried my name in bold type, but the return address was David's company headquarters. I opened it, expecting perhaps a formality, maybe a tax update. Instead, it was a set of documents bearing my signature, my handwriting, and my approval as senior advisor for historical compliance. The problem was simple and devastating. I had never signed those papers. I stared at the page, at the slanted cursive that looked like mine but wasn't. Someone had copied my hand down to the peculiar loop in the letter M. My chest tightened. In black ink, I was listed as the man responsible for validating his corporation's records, the very same corporation he boasted about to investors every week. The implication was clear. If his company failed to meet any obligation, my name would be the shield. I carried the papers to Clara's office the next morning. Clara is David's wife, always polished, always calculating. Her desk was spotless, her computer screen glowing with spreadsheets and projected earnings. When I handed her the envelope, she did not flinch. She simply folded her hands and gave me that thin smile of hers. "You should be proud," she said. "David wanted you to have a role. This is a way of honoring you." I told her I had never agreed to it. She shrugged. "Sometimes decisions have to be made quickly. Your reputation helps. You're trusted in this community. People respect your years of service." She leaned back, satisfied with her explanation, as though she had done me a favor. My reputation, the one David had torn apart at the banquet, was now a tool in his arsenal. When he wanted applause, I was nothing. When he wanted cover, I was his mask. I left her office without answering. On the street outside, the traffic moved like nothing had changed. But in my hands, I held proof that my identity had been hijacked. I walked to the courthouse and requested public filings. The clerk, a young man with tired eyes, brought me a stack of documents. Each page carried my forged signature. I was listed as guarantor, advisor, sometimes even as board member. In their records, I was the silent backbone of David's enterprise. My stomach turned as I realized how far the illusion had spread. Back home, I pulled Margaret's photograph from the mantel and set it on my desk. I told her picture what I had seen. In life, she had been gentle but firm, never letting dishonesty slide. I could almost hear her voice telling me to confront David directly, to demand an explanation. But confrontation with my son was like throwing water on stone. It never seeped in. It only splashed back. That evening, I called him. He answered with noise in the background, the hum of voices, the clink of glasses. "Dad, I'm busy," he said. I told him about the documents. He laughed. "It's just paperwork. Don't overthink it." Everyone does it. It makes things smoother. It's a compliment, really. Shows I trust you. Before I could respond, he ended the call. To him, I was not a father, but a rubber stamp. I sat in the dark after that call, listening to the house creak. The betrayal was sharper than the insult at the banquet. Mockery stings, but forgery binds. My very name had been taken from me, reshaped into something that served him. It wasn't about money. It was about ownership of identity. The man I had raised had turned me into a puppet without strings. The following days, I watched the local news. Reporters praised David for securing a contract with the city. They spoke of his solid advisory board and his experienced mentors. My name was mentioned, praised as a veteran educator guiding a modern enterprise. Neighbors stopped me on the sidewalk, shaking my hand, congratulating me for supporting my son. Each compliment cut deeper, because none of them knew I had never given my blessing. I began keeping a new notebook, separate from the old journals of history. In this one, I wrote down every forged signature, every false statement, every casual lie. It was the only way to keep my mind clear. If I did not record it, I feared it would vanish into rumor, and I would start doubting myself. Each page felt like a small act of resistance. Clara came by one afternoon, unannounced. She placed a box of wine on my counter, speaking lightly as though we were allies. "Don't take David's words too seriously," she said. "He just knows how to perform for a crowd." She glanced at my desk, where the notebook lay open. Her eyes lingered too long. She knew what I was doing. "You don't need to document every little thing," she said softly. "It only makes you bitter." But her tone carried warning, not comfort. I closed the notebook and offered her no reply. She left the wine, but carried her silence with her. I realized then that Clara was not merely following David. She was part of the machinery, smoothing over the edges, silencing dissent. Where David shouted, she whispered. Together they carved away at truth until it fit their design. One night, unable to sleep, I walked to the old high school where I had spent my life teaching. The windows were dark, the halls silent. I sat on the front steps and remembered the countless evenings I had stayed late grading papers, preparing lessons, talking with students who had nowhere else to go. That building held proof of my influence, though no reporter would ever mention it. And now my own son had repurposed that influence into a false credential for his empire. When dawn broke, I stood and swore to myself that I would not remain silent. I would trace the path of every forged document, every stolen story, and I would not let my identity be swallowed by his ambition. The insult at the banquet had wounded me, but this theft declared war. He had taken my name, and I intended to take it back. I was at the library when I first saw my own words staring back at me, printed on glossy paper with David's photograph beside them. He had been featured in a business magazine, the kind displayed near the entrance, for visitors to flip through. On the cover, he looked polished, confident, the perfect image of a modern entrepreneur. The headline read, "Leading Through Stories, How David Monroe Shapes the Future of Logistics." Inside, under his portrait, were passages that had once belonged to me. He had lifted them straight from the journals I used in class. A story I had told my students about a coal miner who organized his neighbors in the 1930s. A lesson about how ordinary people kept democracy alive during dark times. Even a phrase I used year after year. History is not the story of the powerful, it is the echo of the forgotten. I had written those words in 1987 on a chalkboard. Now they were printed as David's personal philosophy, credited to him as if he had coined them while building his company. My hands shook as I turned the pages. It was not only theft, it was transformation. What had once been lessons meant to remind young people of humility had been repurposed as slogans of corporate ambition. The miner's struggle became a metaphor for David's expansion into new markets. The echo of the forgotten became a motto for his innovative leadership. My life's teaching had been gutted, rebranded, sold back to the public as his wisdom. I closed the magazine and returned it to the shelf. The librarian gave me a curious glance, perhaps sensing the tension in my grip, but I walked out without a word. Outside, the winter air felt heavier than before. My identity had been forged on paper in legal filings, and now my voice had been stolen in print. I no longer recognized the line between my life and David's invention. That night, I searched online. Dozens of interviews, podcasts, and speeches appeared under his name. Again and again, I heard echoes of my lessons. He quoted events I had lectured on, retold stories I had collected from families in town, reshaped them into tales of personal triumph. Each sentence was a mirror distorted. My classroom had become his script. A few days later, I received an unexpected call. The voice on the line was warm but hesitant. "Mr. Monroe, this is Sarah Thompson. I don't know if you remember me." I remembered at once. Sarah had been one of my brightest students in the late 90s, always scribbling notes furiously, always staying after class to ask questions. Now she was a reporter for the local paper. She told me she had been covering David's rise, attending his events, writing articles about his supposed leadership style. But something troubled her. "He tells stories that sound familiar," she said. "Stories I know I heard from you first." We agreed to meet at a small cafe downtown. When I arrived, Sarah was already seated, her laptop open, papers spread around. She had grown into a confident woman, but her eyes still held the same intensity from when she was my student. She showed me transcripts of David's speeches. I read them and nodded. Every line had roots in my classroom. "He tells the story of the miner as if his own grandfather lived it," Sarah said. "And the speech he gave last month about communities holding together during crises. That was your lecture after 9/11s. I still have the notes from that class." She slid a yellowed page across the table. In faded ink were my exact words, written in her teenage handwriting. She had kept them all these years. I held the paper, my throat tightening. It was proof, not forged signatures or legal jargon, but living testimony from someone who had been there. Sarah looked at me steadily. "Mr. Monroe, he's rewriting history, and people believe him." I asked her why she hadn't published anything. She sighed. "Editors love him. He's a hometown success story. If I accuse him of stealing from his father, they'll call it family bitterness. I need something undeniable, something they can't dismiss as hearsay." I promised her I would find it. She closed her laptop, gathered her papers, and touched my hand briefly before leaving. "You mattered more than you know," she said softly. "Don't let him erase it." Her words stayed with me. For years I had doubted whether my teaching left any mark. Now, in front of me, sat proof that at least one student still carried my lessons. It should have brought comfort, but instead it deepened the sting, because the same words had been twisted by my own son into weapons of self-promotion. Back at home, I pulled out the boxes of journals stacked in the study. I flipped through decades of notes, anecdotes, lessons, quotes, scribbles from long nights of preparation. I saw my handwriting, clumsy at times, but always mine. Each page was a brick in a structure David had stolen. The thought made me ill. I lit the fireplace and considered burning one of the notebooks just to see the ink curl into ash. But I stopped. Destroying them would only finish the erasure he had begun. Instead, I began marking them with colored tabs, organizing them by story, by date, by class. If Sarah needed undeniable evidence, I would prepare it. I would build a wall of truth that could not be painted over. As I worked, I thought of Margaret. She had always encouraged me to keep those journals. She said one day they would matter. I used to laugh at her, saying no one would ever care. Now, ironically, she was right in a way I had never imagined. They mattered, not because people sought my wisdom, but because my own bloodline had stolen it. The next Sunday, I attended church for the first time in years. I needed to sit among people who had known me long before David's empire. After the service, a man approached, someone I recognized vaguely as a parent of a former student. He shook my hand warmly. "Your boy is something else," he said. "The way he tells those stories, it inspires us." I forced a smile, but inside, rage coiled. Even here, in the sanctuary, David's fiction had replaced me. That evening, Sarah called again. She had attended one of David's panels and recorded it. She sent me the file. I listened to my son, standing on a stage, retelling the story of a soldier returning from Vietnam and finding meaning in rebuilding his town. That story had belonged to my neighbor decades ago, a man who had poured his soul out to me one quiet night. I had shared it with students to teach resilience. Now David claimed it as his personal family heritage. The theft was spreading like a stain. Every platform he touched carried a piece of me disguised as him. The town, the newspapers, the audiences, none of them knew they were applauding a lie. I sat late into the night, the audio playing again and again, the fire dwindling to embers. I thought of Sarah's faith, of her yellowed notes, of her plea not to let him erase me. My notebooks lay open around me, their pages glowing faintly in the lamplight. They were my last defense. I realized then that I was no longer just a father, fighting a son. I was a witness fighting erasure, and for the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of resolve stronger than despair. If he wanted to build a future on my words, then I would show the world whose voice they truly were. The story he told about me did not start with a lie. It started with a photograph. It appeared on a brochure at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast, a small image in the corner under the heading "Where I Come From." The face was turned 3/4 away, the classroom behind it blurred, but I knew the posture, the thinning hair, the jacket I had worn far too long. The caption said the man in the picture believed in keeping things as they were, and that this belief had been an obstacle his son had to overcome. In a single sentence, I had been reduced to a cautionary tale. I took the brochure and sat in the back of the conference room while David worked the crowd. He stood at the podium in a perfect suit, telling a room of business owners that growth required shedding the weight of old thinking. He never used my name. He did not need to. He described a father who catalogued stories no one asked to. Here, who measured life in notebooks and caution, who taught children to respect limits instead of chase horizons. The room laughed softly at the right places. They looked up to him, the man who had escaped the pull of someone like me. After the talk, a line formed to shake his hand. I stayed seated and turned the brochure over. On the back, a timeline traced the arc of his origin. It credited a high school lecture that taught him how small towns cling to myths. The same lecture I gave every year about the danger of rewriting the past for convenience. He quoted the lesson as if he had opposed it from the start, as if he had had to unlearn everything I ever taught. The words I had built to protect memory now served as stones to build his triumph. When the crowd dispersed, a man approached and asked if I would sign his program the way fathers of famous sons do when they are folded into the brand. I handed it back to him unsigned and walked out into the grey morning. On the sidewalk, I passed a placard advertising David's keynote 2 weeks from now, the one everyone said would draw thousands. He leads through narrative, the placard promised. I read the line twice and kept walking. Sarah sent me a link that afternoon to an investor deck making the rounds online. In the deck I found a page labeled Lessons from Home. It listed phrases I had written on chalkboards. The ordinary carry history. Memory is a civic duty. The stories we keep decide who we become. Each phrase was followed by a short paragraph, describing how those ideas had held David back until he forged his own way. He positioned discipline as fear, caution as cowardice, context as an anchor. He made obedience to truth sound like a symptom of weakness. My classroom had become his hurdle. I printed the deck and slid it into the new notebook where I recorded everything related to him. On the inside of the notebook's cover, I taped the chamber brochure, then the deck pages, then to clippings from newspapers that repeated the same arc. The sun who rose despite a rigid, antiquated home. I indexed each item by date and source. I had spent decades teaching teenagers to gather evidence with care. Now I was building a case no one had asked. For manual labor with paper and glue. A call came the next day from a man who introduced himself in a voice trained to sound neutral. Michael Grant, he said, was a college friend of David's and now his attorney. The sort who keeps a suit jacket on the back of a chair and a settlement template in every drawer. He asked if I could stop by his office to clear up a few small mismatches. The phrase was chosen with precision. I agreed. His office sat on the top floor of a renovated mill. All exposed brick and framed law school diplomas, the decor of credibility. Michael rose to meet me with a measured smile, the handshake of a man who has calculated the angle and pressure that make people trust him. He motioned toward a conference table where a stack of papers waited under a weighted clip. He explained, pleasantly, that there had been confusion around my role with David's company. He noted that my name appeared in background materials, an honorary advisory position, he called it, and that it would help everyone if I signed a short statement. Acknowledging my support for David's work, he did not rush his sentences. He used calm verbs. He described the statement as a courtesy for the record, an elegant way to keep stories aligned. He observed that publicity sometimes blurs lines, and that a unified narrative prevents misunderstanding. He never said the word. Pressure, he did not need to. On the table, the pen lay parallel to the signature line, a quiet invitation. I asked him how the advisory role had appeared in filings I had never seen. He replied that startups move quickly and sometimes paperwork pre-populates. He asked, gently, if I really wanted to pick a fight with a process. He added, almost as an afterthought, that investors get nervous when an elder in the family appears publicly unsupportive. He said it like weather, inevitable, neither his fault nor mine. He told me, with the tone of a man offering a kindness, that a modest retainer could accompany the statement, an acknowledgement of time and experience. I did not sign. I slid the papers back across the table, the pages soft from the prints of other hands. I told him I would not affirm what I did not believe. He regarded me for a long second, then nodded as if he had expected that answer and already had a shelf for it in his mind. He walked me out without raising his voice, all civility intact, the door closing with a hush engineered by the buildings. Designer. It was a practiced exit. Everything smooth, nothing resolved. On the sidewalk I found myself standing near a poster for David's keynote again. A young man taped it over a faded notice about a school board meeting, like layers of paper. Across a city wall, one announcement was covering another, one story laying claim to the place where another had stood. I watched the last corner smooth under his palm. The image on the poster was David on a stage, arms spread, a black book in his hand. At the bottom of the cover, I saw a pattern I recognized without wanting to. Margaret's habit of pressing a flower into the first page of every journal she kept left a faint stain that bled through. In the poster, the stain was visible at the edge of the book's lower corner. I stared until the young man asked if I needed help. I said no and walked on. I did not take a photograph. I did not peel the poster down. Instead, I went home and opened the cedar chest where Margaret's things were stored. Her journals had once stacked neatly there, bound in leather and twine, each with a flower pressed in the front. I counted them and came up short by one. The cover missing from the chest matched the pattern on the poster, a dark spine with two scoffs where Margaret had dropped it in the kitchen years ago. I closed the chest and sat on the floor, my hand on the lid as if my touch could keep the rest from drifting outward into someone else's script. I did not call David to ask. I did not call Clara. I took the chamber brochure from my pocket and taped it beneath the index of my new notebook. Then I wrote a single line on the next page, keynote book in hand, edge, stain visible, cover scuffs match. I forced my pen to steady itself and added the date and location. Facts were ballast. Without them, I would float into rage. Sarah reached out that evening with a draft article her editor had asked her to prepare about David's storytelling leadership. She wanted my reaction before she sent it. The draft quoted lines from his past speeches and summarized the chamber remarks I had heard that morning. She had written tightly, the way journalists do when their words will be cut, in the margin. She asked if I could confirm whether a particular sentence had ever been my phrase. The sentence claimed he grew up under the shadow of a father lost in history. I wrote back and told her that I had given a lecture once about the dangers of calling the past a trap. I had used the phrase shadow as a metaphor for memory's comfort. He had taken it and turned it into a portrait of me. She replied with a single sentence, "The story is getting bolder." She attached a flyer for a networking event where David would preview part of the keynote. She could get me in, she said, if I wanted to hear it with my own ears. I told her I would come. The preview took place in a repurposed warehouse lit by strings of warm bulbs, the kind of light that makes ambition look romantic. I took a seat near the back, blending in among young professionals clutching name tags and craft cocktails. When David took the small stage, the room leaned forward. He spoke about risk and reinvention, the same words he had wielded for months, but now he added a new passage. He recounted a story of a boy corrected at the dinner table every time he spoke, told to slow down, to cite sources, to respect the facts. He said he had felt caged by that ritual, that he had had to teach himself to ignore the warnings of a man who feared the future. Heads nodded, as if a shared memory had been named. I had corrected my son at the dinner table. I had asked him to back up his claims. I had believed that insisting on truth was a form of love. In his version, that habit became the origin of a wound he had to overcome. The audience applauded the confession of a burden shed. He held up the black book. He said it reminded him that stories define reality, and that we must choose the ones that serve us. He slid the book into his jacket as if tucking away a talisman. After the event, I stood near the exit while people filed past, flushed with admiration. I waited until the space had thinned and then walked to the stage. The mic was still warm, the air smelling of wire and sweat. I touched the podium, the wood polished by other hands. On its ledge lay a note card with 3 phrases written in bold marker: rise above legacy, break the frame, write your own archive. The last phrase stung more than the others. Write your own archive. He was not only using my work, he was urging others to replace the records that did not flatter them. On the way out, I passed a table stacked with branded notebooks the event team had set out for guests. On each cover, a line was embossed: "History favors the storyteller." It was a clean line, easy to swallow, and people took the notebooks gladly. I did not pick one up. I went home and opened the journals that remained in the cedar chest and ran my fingers over their covers, like a blind man reading for the edge of a cliff. The next morning, Michael called again. His voice was as smooth as before. He said he had heard I attended the preview, and he hoped I had enjoyed it. He suggested, gently, that public disagreement would confuse audiences and harm the company. He said dissonance distracts from growth. He implied that my silence would be a gift. He offered again to fold me into the story in a way that would make us all look good. He used the phrase win-win without embarrassment. I told him I would neither bless nor disguise what I had seen. He took the refusal with professional courtesy, promised to keep the lines open, and ended the call with the same mild warmth. He had begun it. For men like Michael, friction is a scheduling issue. He would move to the next line on his calendar and wait for time to soften me. I did not soften. I returned to the notebook and added a section labeled Claims About Father. Underneath I listed each anecdote he had used, alongside the earliest place it appeared in my teaching materials. Beside the dinner table corrections, I wrote the year Margaret teased me for grading conversation like essays, and beneath it I taped a photograph of a chalkboard from the old classroom where those phrases first lived. I included dates because dates matter, not as weapons, but as weights. I wanted gravity on my side. By evening, I had assembled a binder of primary sources any student would have recognized as enough to pass a rigorous assessment. I placed the binder on the table and stared at it until the room blurred. I did not feel vindicated. I did not feel strong. I felt like a man standing in front of a mirror that someone else had moved an inch every night, discovering at last how far the reflection had drifted. I slept poorly and woke before light, unsettled by the image of the black book in his hand, the flower stain at its edge. In the kitchen, I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the street. A neighbor walked a dog past the mailbox at the curb. The flag on the box was down, nothing waiting, nothing sent. I thought about what messages travel and which die in place. I thought about how easily a life can be rewritten if the person who lived it refuses to speak. I set the coffee down, opened the notebook, and wrote one more line. If he insists I never influenced anyone, he will learn what it looks like when one quiet life refuses to be edited. Then I closed the cover, took a breath that hurt a little, and began preparing for the day when he would have to hear me in a room where he no longer controlled the story. I never expected an invitation to arrive with my name written in bold letters on an envelope, but there it was in the mailbox one morning. It was not from David. It came from a woman named Emily Carter, the coordinator for the statewide leadership summit. She wrote that she had heard of my lifelong dedication to education and community history and wanted me to appear on stage before a crowd of 5,000, sharing reflections about the importance of stories in shaping identity. She had no idea of the war that had already been waged over my words. To her, I was not a relic, nor a villain in someone else's myth, but a man worth listening to. I sat at the kitchen table, the invitation heavy in my hands. For weeks, I had collected evidence of David's theft. I had built binders of proof, stacked them like sandbags against the flood of lies. But here was a chance to step into the light without showing a single page, to speak in my own voice before the largest audience I would ever face. The thought filled me with equal parts dread and resolve. I could feel Margaret's absence more sharply than ever. She would have told me whether to go. Instead, I looked at her empty chair and imagined her telling me to stop hiding in the margins. I called the number on the invitation, and Emily answered with an energy that made me feel decades younger. She spoke quickly, explaining how the summit wanted voices from different generations, not just executives and politicians. She said people needed to hear wisdom grounded in lived experience. I told her I was not a performer, not a polished orator. She laughed kindly and said that was precisely the point. Authenticity. She wanted me to be exactly who I was. I agreed, though I kept to myself the storm that authenticity would unleash. News of my participation spread quickly through the town. Neighbors stopped me on the street, some surprised I had been chosen, others pleased that an old teacher was finally being recognized. I could feel their pride, but underneath it lay the echo of David's narrative. More than once I overheard someone say, maybe his son's success rubbed off on him. Even my own recognition was being reframed as an extension of David's. The irony grew sharper when I discovered that David himself was scheduled to speak at the same summit, though on a different day. His session was marketed as the highlight of the program, from local roots to global vision. Posters with his face were plastered across the city, his schedule splashed in bold. My name was printed much smaller, tucked into a list of community perspectives, yet the numbers were clear. My session was expected to fill the largest hall. Emily told me registrations had surged unexpectedly after my announcement. I could almost hear David grinding his teeth from across town. I knew he would not ignore this. Sure enough, Clara appeared at my door one evening. She stood on the porch with a look of uneasy determination. She carried herself like a woman caught between loyalty and conscience. She said David was concerned about my speech, that it might muddy the narrative he had been building. Her words were chosen carefully, but her eyes betrayed something. More fatigue, maybe even guilt. She asked what I planned to say. I told her simply that I would speak the truth. She nodded, her lips tight, then added that David was considering legal safeguards if I strayed into defamation. I laughed, though the sound had no humor. How strange that a son would warn his father not to tell the truth about his own life. That night I pulled Margaret's chest from under the bed again. I ran my hands over the remaining journals. I imagined David slicing pieces from them, cutting and pasting until even Margaret's words turned against me. The thought hollowed me, but it also hardened my resolve. If my wife's memory was at stake, then I had no choice but to fight. The summit day arrived with a sharp wind. I wore the same jacket I had worn for years, patched at the elbow but still sturdy. When I entered the convention center, Emily met me with a warm handshake. She looked relieved to see me, as though she had worried I might back out. She walked me backstage, explaining the schedule, pointing out where I would stand, how the lights would shift. None of it mattered to me. What mattered was the audience I could already hear, the low roar of 5,000 people waiting. As I stepped into the wings, I saw a familiar figure across the hall. David. He was not scheduled to speak that day. Yet there he was, mingling with organizers, shaking hands, slipping effortlessly into the space. He had come to watch me. Our eyes met for a moment. His expression was unreadable, a blend of calculation and defiance. He did not approach me. He did not need to. His presence was enough, a silent warning that my every word would be measured against him. Emily gave the introduction, her voice ringing with enthusiasm. She spoke of my decades of teaching, my devotion to preserving the town's history, my role as a mentor to countless students. Then she gestured toward the stage. I walked into the lights, the applause rolling like a wave. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of attention, not as judgment, but as expectation. I began simply. I told them that stories are not decorations, not ornaments for speeches, but the bones that hold us upright. I spoke of miners, of soldiers, of families who endured hardship not for glory but for one another. I could feel the silence deepen as the audience leaned in. These were not polished anecdotes designed for branding. They were raw, unvarnished fragments of truth. Then, deliberately, I told them something that had always guided me. History does not belong to the winners. It belongs to the witnesses. The words hung in the air, heavy, final, and I knew that everyone who had ever heard David use my lessons as his own would feel the weight of that sentence differently now. From the corner of my eye, I saw David shift in his seat. His jaw was tight, his hands clasped. For once, he was not the storyteller in control. For once, he was the audience to a narrative he could not edit. When I finished, the hall erupted. The applause was not polite, it was thunderous, sustained. People rose to their feet, clapping until my ears rang. I bowed my head slightly, but inside I felt something break loose, a tether I had carried for too long. I had been told I had no influence, that my life had been small, my work forgotten. Yet here, in this moment, 5,000 people stood because of words I had lived by, words no one could take away. Afterward, Emily rushed backstage, her face alight with triumph. She called it the highlight of the summit, said she had never seen a crowd respond so viscerally. I thanked her, but my eyes kept scanning for David. He lingered near the exit, speaking tersely into his phone. He did not congratulate me. He did not approach. But I saw the truth in his posture for the first time. He knew I could not be erased so easily. Still, victory was not complete. For as much as the crowd believed in me now, the stories David had twisted still circulated unchecked. I knew this was only the beginning. The journals, Margaret's memory, the falsified filings, all of it waited in the shadows. Tonight had been a glimpse of what was possible. But the war over memory was far from over. When I returned home, the jacket still smelling faintly of stage lights, I placed the invitation back in its envelope and slid it into Margaret's chest. Then I sat with the journals spread around me, a quiet fortress against the lies. The crowd's applause still echoed in my head, but underneath it pulsed a darker rhythm, the certainty that David would not let this stand. He had watched me command a stage larger than any he had ever faced, and I knew, as surely as I knew the lines of my own handwriting, that he would strike back. The night after the summit, I expected silence. Instead, my doorbell rang just past 9. On the porch stood Clara, her posture stiff, her face pale under the porch light. She asked if she could come in. I hesitated, because every time she had stepped into my house before, it was to smooth David's lies with polished reassurances. Still, I opened the door. She walked past me, clutching a slim leather folder. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She set the folder on the kitchen table and stood with her arms crossed, as though she were trying to hold herself together. I opened it and saw photocopies of Margaret's handwriting, but the words, the tone, were warped. Passages cut mid-sentence, whole paragraphs missing. Others spliced together to create something that was not my wife's voice at all. My chest burned as I read a line that suggested she doubted me, another that painted me as a man consumed by bitterness and pettiness. It was a grotesque patchwork. Clara sat opposite me and finally spoke. Her voice was low, steady, but I caught the strain beneath it. He's using them. He says they'll prove you've always been resentful, jealous, ungrateful. He's preparing to release them if you keep pushing. She looked away after saying it, as though ashamed of repeating his plan. I touched the edge of one page, tracing Margaret's familiar loops. I remembered the evenings she wrote those entries, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, her pen moving steadily as I graded papers. She had never written to condemn me. these pages had been butchered. I felt as though someone had exhumed her grave and paraded the bones for effect. Clara's eyes flicked to me, then away. I shouldn't be here, she admitted. But I can't keep watching him do this. It's not just business anymore. He's cutting into your marriage, into her memory. Her voice wavered for the first time. I asked why she was showing me. She pressed her lips tight, then said, "Because once he sends these to the press, there's no undoing it. And because I don't think Margaret deserved this." That last sentence came out almost like a confession, and I realized for the first time that behind her polished exterior there was conflict. She had tied herself to David's ambition, but the cost had grown unbearable. I gathered the pages carefully, like shards of broken glass. "Did he know you brought these?" I asked. She shook her head. "If he finds out, I'll deny it. But you need to be ready. He's not going to stop, not after seeing you on that stage." The weight of her words sank in. I had expected retaliation after the summit, but I had not imagined he would drag Margaret into his campaign. The dead cannot defend themselves. That was what made it so cruel and so effective. After she left, I spread the pages across the table, aligning the pieces with my old journals, comparing handwriting, searching for seams in the forgery. My hands trembled, not from age, but from rage. Margaret's voice was sacred. For decades, her words had been my compass. To see them twisted into weapons was unbearable. I stayed awake through the night, rereading every copied page, recalling the nights Margaret and I talked about integrity, about how truth could be fragile but never disposable. I could almost hear her reminding me that silence in the face of deceit was its own kind of betrayal at dawn. I walked to the backyard and stood by the maple tree we had planted together when David was a boy. I had planted it to mark his birth, a symbol of roots and endurance. Now its branches towered above me, a silent witness to all that had unfolded. I told the tree out loud that I would not let her words be stolen. The words echoed strangely in the empty morning, but they steadied me. That afternoon, Clara called again. Her voice was taut, hurried. She said David had scheduled a meeting with Michael Grant, the lawyer, to draft a statement based on the altered journals. She warned me this was my last chance to prepare before the narrative became public. She hung up quickly, as though afraid of being overheard. I realized then that the fight was no longer just about me. If Margaret's memory could be rewritten, so could the memory of everyone I had ever taught, every story I had preserved. The lie was spreading like fire, and fire had to be met with fire, or with something stronger. I went back to my study and opened the locked cabinet where Margaret's true journals remained. I had kept them hidden, not from the world, but from myself, because some truths in those pages unsettled me. Yet now they were the only anchor left. I pulled out one volume, its cover worn from her hands. Inside, her voice was whole, uncut, luminous. She wrote about her pride in my teaching, her doubts about the world we were leaving to David, her quiet faith in resilience. Reading her real words after seeing the mutilated copies was like breathing after nearly drowning. But I also knew what those pages contained, details of mistakes I had made, moments of stubborn pride I had concealed even from David. If the forgeries painted me cruel, the originals revealed me flawed. Still, better flawed than fabricated. That night, I copied a single line into my notebook. A legacy is not what you leave behind, but what you refuse to let others steal. It wasn't Margaret's sentence, it was mine. But it was born of her, and it carried her spirit. The next morning, I prepared. I organized my binders, arranged my notes, and placed Margaret's journals on the desk. The path ahead was clear, though perilous. David had escalated beyond ambition into desecration. He had taken my wife's voice, but I still had the originals. That was the weapon he could not fabricate. And as I looked at those journals, I felt something shift. The battle was no longer about proving my influence. It was about protecting hers. And I knew there was nothing I would not risk to do it. I spent the morning turning the kitchen into a war room. The table was littered with the mutilated pages Clara had slipped me, and beside them, the unopened boxes that had sat in my attic. For years, dust coated the cardboard, the smell of old paper clinging to it. They had been Margaret's sanctuary and mine her journals. My lesson plans, our lives pressed into ink and yellowing paper. For decades, I had sealed them away, afraid of what they might reveal, unwilling to let even David rifle through them. Now they were my last defense. I opened the first box slowly, as if diffusing something volatile. Inside, notebooks bound in leather, others cheap and spiral bound, all stacked neatly in the order she had kept them. Her handwriting stared back at me, graceful loops, precise margins, the same careful patience she had shown in life. My throat tightened. I had almost forgotten how steady her script looked, how it carried a kind of quiet authority. I began matching entries. On the left, David's copies, the butchered versions Clara had shown me. On the right, Margaret's originals. It was like comparing a melody to static. One page in the forgery read, "I fear Elias lives bitter, holding onto grudges that rot the family." I turned to the original and found the truth. "I fear Elias lives with too much weight on his shoulders, holding on to his duty even when the family cannot see it." Entirely different intent. Entirely different. Man, I kept going, page after page, my pulse quickening as the pattern revealed itself. The fabrications weren't subtle, they were deliberate, surgical. Whole contexts stripped, words repositioned, sentiments inverted. It was the kind of mutilation that only a person who despised you would commit. And it wasn't just about MIT. It was about Margaret too. They had erased her compassion, her depth, her loyalty, reducing her to a weapon against me. The hours blurred as I worked, but at last the evidence formed a map across the table. I photographed everything, each original beside its mangled counterfeit. I wrote dates, notes, and highlighted phrases, creating a chronology of truth and distortion. My old habit of grading papers had returned, but this time the red pen was marking crimes, not mistakes. As I worked, I realized the house had grown unbearably silent. The kind of silence that seemed to listen. I shut the blinds, locked the front door, and carried the journals to the den. This wasn't just family betrayal anymore. It was fraud, defamation, theft. And though David thought his revisions would bury me, I now held the proof that could bury him. Late in the evening, I heard footsteps on the porch. For a moment, my stomach dropped, but then a familiar knock followed. It was Sarah Thompson, the former student who had become a reporter. She hadn't visited me in years, but she looked the same, sharp eyes, the kind that missed nothing. She told me she'd been hearing whispers around town, David feeding stories to local outlets, framing me as a bitter recluse who resented his success. I invited her in and showed her one set of pages, careful not to reveal everything yet. She studied them, her eyes narrowing. "These aren't authentic," she said instantly. "It's spliced. Anyone with sense can see it." Then she looked at me. "Do you have the originals?" I hesitated. Handing them over meant relinquishing the one tether I had to Margaret, but it also meant the truth could begin to circulate. Beyond my walls, I showed her one full comparison, original beside forgery. She read silently, her lips pressing tighter with each line. When she finished, she put the papers down and said, "If this goes public, the entire town will have to rethink who they've been listening to. But you need to know, if you step into this, it won't just be about him. People will start digging into you, too." I didn't answer. I couldn't. She was right. But silence was no longer an option. After she left, I sat at the table under the dim light and opened a different notebook, one of my own from years ago. It contained lesson outlines, notes on community events, speeches I had given at school, assemblies. I realized something chilling. Many of those lines, the stories I had once used to inspire students, were the same anecdotes David had recycled in his speeches. He hadn't just stolen Margaret's words, he had stolen mine too. He was building his empire on a counterfeit foundation of my life's work, my marriage, my teaching. That night, I slept little. I dreamt of Margaret sitting across from me, her journals in front of her. She didn't scold, didn't accuse. She only looked at me with that quiet expectation she always carried, the kind that made me believe integrity wasn't a choice but a necessity. By morning, I had decided. I gathered the originals into a locked briefcase. I labeled every forgery and set them aside as evidence. Then I drafted a statement of my own, not for David, but for myself. A declaration that the truth was intact, that Margaret's memory would not be rewritten, that my life would not be recast by anyone, not even my son. As I wrote, I could hear the echo of David's words from that dinner. "You had no influence." But as I looked at the journals, at the stories I had saved, I knew he was wrong. Influence wasn't measured in applause or headlines. It was measured in the voices that carried forward when you were gone. Margaret's voice was still here, intact, unbroken. Mine would be too, if I chose to defend it. The briefcase sat by the door as the sun rose. Heavy, unassuming, yet more powerful than any speech David had given. I was ready, not because I wanted revenge, but because silence would mean complicity, and I would not let my wife's word soar, my own be desecrated without answer. The war was no longer looming. It had arrived, and I had finally armed myself with the truth. I had the briefcase locked, the documents organized, the evidence arranged so clearly that even a stranger could see how David had butchered the truth. I was ready to walk into any room, set the pages down, and dismantle the empire he had built out of lies. But before I sealed the last notebook, I flipped through Margaret's words one final time, telling myself it was out of reverence, not doubt. Her handwriting was steady. As ever, the loops measured. The ink faded in some places where tears must have touched the page. At first I skimmed, reminding myself of the entries I had already studied, her defenses of me, her accounts of school assemblies, her quiet hopes for our son. But deeper into the journals, I found entries I hadn't remembered, or perhaps ones I had deliberately ignored. The first line that stopped me read, "Sometimes Elias tells his stories differently to others than he did to me. I don't think he lies. I think he needs to believe his version." I stared at it for a long time. I told myself it was just an observation, not an accusation. But the pages that followed were harder to explain away. She had written about a local incident from decades ago, a student protest that had rattled the school board. In David's retellings, he painted me as a man who had resisted change, a stubborn relic. I had always countered that by saying I was misrepresented, that I had defended the students. Yet here in Margaret's handwriting was a line that burned. Elias softened the story when he retold it at dinner. He did not stand with the students that day. He enforced the board's decision. He carries shame, and I fear he wants to bury it under a nobler version. My hand shook as I turned the page. There were more. Notes about arguments I had forgotten, choices I had reframed even in my own memory. Each entry seemed to strip away the shield I had carried for decades. She hadn't judged me cruelly, her tone was always gentle. But she had seen me. She had seen the man who wanted to be remembered as steadfast when in truth he had faltered. I pushed the journal away and pressed my palms to the table. All at once, the plan I had built, the confrontation, the public vindication, looked less like a triumph and more like a gamble. If I presented everything, if I handed the originals to Sarah or laid them before a crowd, these passages would come out too. Margaret's journals weren't only my weapon against David, they were also an indictment of me. I closed my eyes, but memories surged unbidden. I remembered that day at the school, the chants echoing through the halls, the board demanding order. I had chosen caution over courage. I had told myself I was protecting my job, my family. Later, when the dust settled, I reshaped the memory, smoothing over the parts that stung. Over time, I even came to believe the polished version. And when I told the story to David as a boy, I made myself the defender, not the enforcer. Now I understood what Margaret had meant. I hadn't lied outright. I had sculpted the truth until it no longer bruised me, and in doing so, I had created the very flaw I accused David of committing, altering memory to suit one's image. The thought made me sick. How could I stand before 5,000 people and call my son a fraud when my own hands weren't clean? Wouldn't David leap at the chance to expose these entries, to turn the accusations back on me? The crowd wouldn't see the careful distinctions. They wouldn't care that my revisions were born of shame, not malice. All they would see was a man who preached honesty yet rewrote his past. I sat there for hours. The briefcase opened beside me, the journals spread like a jury around me. Every path forward led to pain. If I stayed silent, David's falsehoods would define Margaret and me forever. If I spoke, my own failures would surface, staining the legacy I had spent a lifetime preserving. That night, Clara called. Her voice trembled, as though she too had been holding back storms. She said David was escalating, feeding more stories to the press, preparing a keynote where he would unveil Margaret's words, his mutilated versions, as proof of my bitterness. She urged me to act quickly before his narrative became permanent. I almost told her everything then about the lines I had found in Margaret's handwriting, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I told her I was preparing. I promised her David wouldn't get the last word. She thanked me and hung up, unaware of the storm raging inside me. Later, I carried the journals to the living room and placed them on the coffee table. I sat back, staring at the leather covers, the spines cracked. Even my failings. She hadn't buried them for my sake.